10 years after the BBC Spotlight programme brought the scandal of the illegal dump at Mobuoy to public attention, 2 company directors have been sentenced for their roles. In a 2-part episode, we look at the background to this unprecedented environmental crime in Northern Ireland. In the first part, we talk to the director of Friends of the Earth in Northern Ireland, James Orr, who looked at the background to the case and his expectations for the outcome ahead of sentencing. In the second part, lifelong fisher on the River Faughan, former planner and now activist Dean Blackwood, talks to us about the significance of the sentence handed down by the court and the prospects for a public inquiry.
Rights of the River Faughan include the rights of communities who depend on the river, enjoy the river, and protect the river. The rights of the River Faughan are therefore synonymous with the rights of humans. This is akin to a community impact statement, but in this submission, the community is the river ecosystem.
Today we are here to talk about the first victim impact statement to be given by a river in Northern Ireland. The River Faughan near Derry is beside the Mobuoy dump, which has been the site of illegal waste dumping. We are interviewing James Orr from Friends of the Earth, who's campaigning for a public inquiry and has helped draft this victim impact statement. So, first of all, I would like to ask, how was something like this allowed to happen?
That's the main question to be asked. And I still don't think we have adequate answers to that question. What I can say is that it was enabled. It wasn't allowed. It was enabled or facilitated by multiple agencies. Multiple agencies that I want to emphasise whose job it was to protect the River Faughan, its tributaries, where it flows out into Lough Foyle, but in particular the species of wildlife that the site was designated for. So the site is really important for its adjoining woodlands. It's really important for species like otter, species like Atlantic salmon. And for those reasons, the site was designated a special area of conservation. Now, what that means is that that's the most highly protected designation to be given to any site. So add on those layers of so-called protection, including one called an area of special scientific interest, and then add on the complexities of environmental governance. And what you saw is that the revolving door of holes in the ground, these are illegal quarries in the main, being turned into illegal landfill sites, is actually now a very common feature in Northern Ireland. There's at least 40 priority illegal sites, maybe not as big as the River Faughan, but collectively much more significant in terms of the damage that they cause. So we had the local council not enforcing properly in terms of environmental health. We had the environmental crime unit with Dara failing to do its duty. You had the planning authorities not enforcing when they knew that these operations were taking place unlawfully. And then you had a remarkable situation as well under something called the Aggregates Levy Credit Scheme, with the digging of the holes in the ground for sand and gravel. That was actually subsidised by the tax bodies in Northern Ireland. So they were given over £1 million in tax subsidies to carry out illegal activity, which inevitably became one of Europe's most toxic and heinous environmental crimes.
This illegality was originally reported by Christopher Mills in his 2013 report. What were the main findings and how did these highlight systemic failings?
So the Mills report didn't unearth the environmental crimes. These had been reported by local fishing groups for many years before. What the Mills report did is stood back. He was a regulator that was brought in from a separate jurisdiction, in this case Wales, to look at how quarrying in particular was or was not regulated within Northern Ireland. So when the Mills report came out, it was fairly damning. It painted this picture of a toxic relationship between the planning authorities, the grant-giving agencies, and the lack of environmental protection through something called an Environmental Protection Agency. So it addressed issues on a systemic basis, and he talked about the need for transformational change. In fact, as an individual, he was brought back into the Northern Ireland Environment Agency and worked there for a number of years to try and improve internal practices. There was talk in the report about how special sites in the future ought to be protected, how systems of governance need to be improved by better communication, how something called ROMPS, Review of All Minerals Permissions, which was legislated for some time ago, has never been implemented. And the whole idea of that was to ensure that the quarrying industry meets current environmental standards. There's a whole series of reports and recommendations, and it culminated in the need, I think, for what we're calling for now a public inquiry, because while some elements of the Mills report were addressed by government, many elements have not been addressed. And I think the chronic shame at the minute is that there is so little trust within the environmental governance agencies that the same body that was partly responsible for not implementing the Mills report, in this case the Northern Ireland Environment Agency, is the same body that's meant to be monitoring the effluent coming out of the Mobuoy landfill site. And bear in mind that effluent is actually going into Derry's drinking water supply. It's been abstracted very close and downstream from where the toxic crime actually took place. So there are major issues here of covering and collusion. And again, not just between the agencies I've already mentioned, but when you're looking at the need to fulfill duties to provide potable, healthy and wholesome water, I think there are shortcomings as well with Northern Ireland Water, which is our state water body, in terms of addressing monitoring regimes that are commensurate with the toxicity of the chemicals that are being released at the minute. So we're seeing a pattern replicating itself over time, that even when we have a review, and the Mills review was pretty good in my book, there are still a whole range of illegal quarries operating in Northern Ireland. There are many, many illegal dumps continuing to happen as well. So did the Mills review achieve anything transformational? In my opinion, no.
How significant is the illegal traffic of this waste, even across the border, perhaps?
So that's a really important issue. And when you look at where a lot of these environmental crimes take place, particularly since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, what we're beginning to discover is that illegal waste crime, illegal extractivism in general, diesel fuel laundering, the decapitation of mountains for various developmental projects, the run of the paramilitary rule of law, these are highly concentrated along the Irish border. So the border is in itself a vector for environmental crime. And you can see why this is happening, because there is a regulatory vacuum. One jurisdiction plays off with another jurisdiction. A lot of our water bodies are cross-border, like the Ban, Lough Neagh catchment, the River Faughan catchment. But there's never been one prosecution where an agency in one jurisdiction has managed to sue a polluter for damaging water quality in another jurisdiction. So yeah, it's a Wild West. It's an environmental merry-go-round. When you look at air pollution in particular, like ammonia pollution and water pollution from phosphorus, you can actually see that, the companies that are usually illegally responsible for these activities feel now that they can operate with an air of immunity and impunity. And this carousel of pollution along the Irish border is highlighted by the extent, the totemic extent of the illegal quarry industry and the illegal transnational migration of waste.
Tell me about the environmental gathering and the origins or the call of the victim impact statement.
Yeah, so a lot of these initiatives in Northern Ireland emerge because I guess we're not afraid anymore. I don't think we feel the fear. I don't think we feel that we're boxed into certain environmental straitjackets. And the gathering occupies a really important role, particularly in the Northwest, of bringing campaignings together and conversations flow. We also had Derry City and Strabane Council being the first council within these islands passing a resolution that recognised the rights of nature. We've also been involved in many discussions with other councils following that groundbreaking declaration. And I suppose it did start with a conversation. I wish I could remember precisely the conversation, but I was speaking to Dean Blackwood, who is a legend in terms of the gathering, but also chair of the River Faughan anglers. And we were talking about this perennial court case and the lack of any certainty around sentencing. This court case in terms of criminality has been on for over 10 years now. So last year, following a conversation with people like Maeve Neal and Dean Blackwood, I just said, I'm going to write it. I'm just going to draft something. So I drafted a statement recognising the rights of the River Faughan, submitted a statement following consultation with Dean and others to the court. And bear in mind, we'd been making short films called Nature's Keepers in relation to the Faughan and other sites as well. This is where individuals are fighting their own side battles, talk from the heart. They're totally unscripted. They convey the integrity of the individual voice and the diversity of the individual voice. And I know I'm paraphrasing Dean at the minute, but he said something very powerful. This was several years ago where we sat at the banks of the river. And he said something along the lines that the Faughan is my river. The Faughan is my river. And the river flows through me as sure as it flows through this landscape. And then he said that he's compelled to give the river a voice. And we'd be having conversations in relation, believe it or not, Loch Ness before the ecological catastrophe took place in 2023. And we'd be having conversations with lawyers that Peter has been involved in as well, looking at the need to shift from environmental protection to a new jurisprudence encompassing non-humankind having similar rights or the same rights as humans. So these conversations are emerging. They're often integrated, they're often codependent, but it was certainly through an informal chat and just saying, well, if nobody else is going to do it, I'm going to have a go. Never drafted one before. Until today, I didn't realize that there were other initiatives across the globe. Peter emailed me sort of information from, I think it was Hong Kong, in cases in Africa as well that have been using this technique for a few years. But there's nothing better than just taking the initiative, feeling it's right in your heart, recognizing that the existing straitjacket of contemporary jurisprudence isn't actually addressing the deep-seated realities as to why we're in this ecological mess and political mess and democratic mess as well. That's how it emerged. It shifted a little bit this year. We were chatting to Eliza from the Committee on Administration of Justice, and Eliza recommended that we frame it in terms of a victim personal statement rather than a victim impact statement to mimic what's happening across the courts here, where individual voices get heard, individual human voices. But it was very much in the basis of the River Faughan, and it was very much related to the waste crimes at Mobuoy. And it was framed this year with some success as well. I'm going to go through that with you. From three people, Maeve O'Neill from The Gathering, Dean Blackwood from the River Faughan Anglers on The Gathering, and myself as the three authors of it. And this year, I think we got a certain amount of traction in the courts.
Will the victim impact statement be formally introduced in the sentence hearing?
Well, we're waiting for the sentence hearing. We've been waiting for a number of years now, and we thought it was going to happen in the last few weeks. That's a really good question. So what happened this year is that we wrote to victim support and we asked them, because that is one of the acceptable mechanisms for introducing victim statements to courts. We asked them for their advice. They suggested we contacted the Public Prosecution Service. I wrote once to the PPS, wrote twice, wrote 3 times, eventually got a response. And the response was that this will be brought to the attention of the court. That happened on the 3rd of October this year. That was hugely significant for us. There was a caveat which says that the PPS cannot say that this will be deemed admissible within the court. That is up to the judge. But what we do know since October this year is that the defence team for the alleged criminals in this court case, they have been arguing with the judge in relation to the admissibility of it. Sometimes when you see something, you can't unsee it. And I think what has happened is that this has become the talk of the judiciary within Northern Ireland. It's become the talk of that particular courthouse. It's certainly new ground that's been broken here. And it's certainly something that hasn't been thrown out. And I think 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that would possibly been the case. But there's been a growing momentum and a growing understanding globally, but also locally, that we need to express the rights of nature in innovative ways. And from my perspective, this is probably the most interesting, groundbreaking initiative that has taken place, certainly within Northern Ireland, in relation to the rights of nature in the last couple of years.
Are there signs that the rights of nature conversation is reaching into our judicial system?
Well, very much so. And I think Peter can vouch for this as well, because at the 15th anniversary of the PILS, Public Interest Litigation Support event in the Arab Hotel, the Lady Chief Justice spoke recently, and she invited the court hearing in relation to Lough Neagh and the rights of nature, because she was anticipating this because of reviews that have been happening across the world where legally affordable nature rights have been given to rivers and been given to the mountain systems, have been given to individual species. And, she could see the writing on the wall that it's inevitable, given the strength as well of the environmental justice movement within Northern Ireland, who have embraced this concept wholeheartedly. And in virtually every meeting that takes place at the minute, we had a sort of Christmas celebration last week. The rights of nature was introduced to virtually every conversation. So that's downstream, that's grassroots mobilization and grassroots conversation. And now it's beginning to be ventilated within fairly conservative circles, but also we have a new Lady Chief Justice, and I think there's a different temperament around the courts in Northern Ireland because of the leadership that she's bringing. But also this is a way of the world at the minute. And I think in terms of what we're saying at the River Faughan, the only allegation left is that they say, well, we're decentering the human being. And my response to that is, the River Faughan victim impact statement was recentering the human being in terms of a new, more convivial and codependent relationship with Mother Earth. And it's not saying that other species are separate, that they have different rights. It's that if we want to drink healthy water, if we want to see a salmon jump in a river, if we want to introduce our children to catching sticklebacks in a tributary of the River Faughan, if we want to see how life can be enriched and enhanced by a thriving, abundant ecosystem, well, these are our rights as well as the rights of the river. And I think that was expressed very much in terms of the content of the latest iteration of the victim impact statement, that whilst we're moving towards the identification of legally enforceable rights for non-humankind, because we are nature, and I think this is the point, these are as much rights for people, these are as much human rights as they are some abstract form of ecological rights.
So you mentioned the Lady Chief Justice's most recent comments on the rights of nature. Have you considered bringing these to the attention of the courts?
Yeah, we would love to construct a court case which attempts to legally assert rights of nature. The other way to do it is to intervene on court cases that are taking place to identify how impossible it is to assert environmental rights without the environment. By what I mean soil, air, water, without the environment itself having intrinsic rights to exist. There's no point having a right for people to breathe clean air or to drink fresh water unless the water itself has a right to be clean, unless the air itself has a right to be clean. So I think, jurisprudence is moving on. We're beginning to see these massive shifts. The other way to do it, if it's not a court intervention, and asking the court, as happened in Bangladesh, for court precedent to be established around this area, is to try and establish legally enforceable laws, either at a local level, local government level, or certainly at a state level. And I know Peter and others have been working on at an Irish constitutional intervention as well. So there are many paths to achieving this. There are many opportunities at the moment, and conversations are rich, and we're speculating all the time about what the next intervention will be. But certainly in terms of an individual court case, such as this, catastrophic crime just outside Derry. I think, recognizing that nature has rights, if this victim impact assessment is considered to be admissible, is a very significant step forward.
I know you slightly touched on this, but just what inspired this impact statement on behalf of the river as opposed to the human community? You obviously talk about in your impact statement on the emotional, social and financial impact on the human community of this crime, but why focus on the river itself?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I suppose the one way to answer that question is that the river doesn't have a voice. The river needs to have a voice. And despite 50 years of very complex international and local environmental law, we're seeing that the polluters have a voice. We're seeing that slurry tankers who empty their slurry into the River Faughan have a voice. We're seeing that cement factories upstream who are discharging waste into the river, they have legal rights and they have a voice. Everything has a voice except that which is important, and that's the river herself. So that's a very obvious answer. And what's very striking about current framing of environmental law is that these laws were more than likely written by the polluters. They were more than likely written by lobbying from corporate organizations. And that's why they are so intrinsically neutered, because they don't recognize the ecological reality of things, that we're all connected. And I have to come back to the point as well that this is a victim impact statement on behalf of the people. It's on behalf of the economy, because we're talking possibly £700 million to remediate this one site when we have 40 other priority sites in Northern Ireland. So who's going to pay for that? Yeah, who's going to pay for that? And it's not going to be the polluter who pays. That was a principle enshrined in European law, but we seem to have forgotten that. It's going to be people who are paying their taxes who are paying for that. The emotional attachment is incredibly important as well. What the river gives us and what in turn we give back to the river, I think, lacks understanding at the minute in terms of environmental discourse. And I think that emotional bond and that emotional connection, what we say all the time now is that we are not separate from nature, we're not distant from nature, we're not superior to nature, we are nature. And the river impact statement is a testament to those amazing campaigners who have stopped hydroelectric schemes on the Faughan, who have loved the river, who bring their grandchildren there, who walk its banks, who are touched by the very fact that their lives are totally enhanced by the presence of that other living being, which is the river itself. So there's a huge shift in public opinion at the minute, and it's even gone celestial, I got a book the other day which was about who owns the moon. And then if you look in the website about CDR, they have a declaration on the rights of the moon. And that sounds fantastical. But when you read the declaration, what gives Elon Musk, what gives the US government, what gives the Russian, what gives anyone the right to pillage that celestial being that's so in tune with human anatomy, with bodily cycles, with the tides? We're all connected. This is all totally connected. So my dream over the next few years, we see the confluence, the way that a river flows, carried by the surprise of its own unfolding, according to the poem. But, the confluence of rivers and the confluence of thinking that there is indivisibility between the human rights of the people in Derry and the rights of the River Faughan.
If the river was to be granted legal personhood by the court, how would this work? Would a guardian or counsel be responsible for representing the river in legal matter? Would that be a role you would be interested in fulfilling?
Yeah, we're not quite there yet, but that's certainly where we're going at the minute, that the river needs representation. The river needs to be in court fighting for the right not to be polluted, for the right not for its tributaries to be filled in, the right for its discharge points into the sea is not contaminated. I think there needs to be rights as well for species like the salmon to be able to navigate freely back up the river itself. So that's all very complex and it requires significant funding. We do have something called Aarhus cost protection at the minute, where if we take environmental cases, because the costs of going to court are so prohibitively difficult and expensive, then there's a certain amount of leeway given to environmental organisations like ourselves to have our costs capped at certain levels so that if we lose, we don't go bankrupt. I think they could easily be extended on a guardianship model, as you have expressed, in relation to a fund being established. You know, if we're serious about the idea that the polluter pays, ultimately the polluter in this case was not the companies, the waste management companies. The polluters in this case were the state agencies. You know, they create the boxing glove. These companies only put their fist in. So there certainly would require to be significant funding established to take these cases. And then, of course, when you win, that pot, that legal fighting fund, for example, if you want to call it that, can be replenished and maintain its own momentum. Because in many of these cases, the breaches of the law are so clear. You know, and I would certainly think of starting some type of process of ecological litigation by being absolutely sure that the law is on our side. But for that to happen, we do need this personhood issue to be established, either in local laws or by court precedent or by statute. And that's the challenge ahead of us. But yeah, we need to stand in court when a river is being abused, when there's landscape trauma happening. We need to be able and sufficiently resourced to go to court to represent that river. Whether it's Transit the Earth, whether it's another environmental group like The Gathering, whether it's a local group that's been campaigning on the issue, I don't know. But certainly between us all, we are ready for the challenge. We can't wait for that to happen. We're in court all the time, and sometimes when you win, you actually lose because you won on the technicality. And sometimes when you lose, you actually win because you've drawn out proceedings for potentially 5 or 10 years, and then the company goes bankrupt. We're beginning to see that happen in Northern Ireland quite a bit at the minute. So court action is not just about the niceties and crispness of fine legal points. It's also about theatre. It's also about delay. It's also about scandalising issues. It's also about using the performance of the court system to reflect back the power of communities, because they're the ones who are currently excluded because of the costs involved. So this is not about, again, diminishing the rights of people. It's about bringing up to existing standards the rights of the soil, the rights of the air, the rights of the rivers, the rights of mountains, and the rights of habitats to exist and to flourish. So it's about rebalancing. It's not about supplanting other rights. It's about recognising the reality that we can live on a dead planet.
Do you think there are parallels with Colombia, where the courts now recognise nature as a victim in a post-conflict context?
There is absolutely no doubt about that. And I really welcome the question, because you're inviting us to go to some really difficult territory at the minute, but it's the right place to go to. Where you get conflict, often the post-conflict settlement invites in the predators, the vultures, the resource depleters. And we can see that so very clearly in our political dispensation. We have mandatory coalition in Stormont. There's hardly a cigarette paper between the economic policies of the main players in Stormont. They have all adopted very much a neoliberal exploitative paradigm. The paramilitaries have shifted. They haven't disappeared. They have gone into environmental crime because that's where the money is. Or some have gone into drugs crime. But most of them are involved in environmental crime like waste crime because it is so lucrative. One person in one lorry can make £1 million in a year. It is that easy to do. And there's no way that's going to be allowed to happen without political oversight and paramilitary involvement, and what we've seen as well is police collusion. So the parallels with Colombia are very obvious. We've seen some of the biggest mining corporations in the world identify Ireland, but particularly the north of Ireland and the border, as ripe for exploitation. We're heading into the biggest public inquiry Northern Ireland has ever seen. That's the gold mine in Tyrone, with a company who's claimed it's spent hundreds of millions already in a multi-billion pound project. This is the first year in 2024 where we have a 2 billion turnover company in Northern Ireland. That's Moy Park. Guess who owns Moy Park? It's owned by a company in the States, Pilgrim, which is in turn owned by a company in Brazil, JBS. I think the world's biggest food producer. These companies are sucking assets from Northern Ireland. They're stripping us bare. The profits are going elsewhere. The meat, in many cases, from Moy Park is going to particularly England. Some of it's going to China, some of it's Europe, but mostly England. The raw materials that are being extracted from Lough Neagh and other places, and the River Faughan as well, it would be made into concrete. If concrete was a country, it would be the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world after China and the US. So what we're seeing is a ravaged landscape, and what we know from Colombia and elsewhere is that if you want to build peace between people, but also between people and nature, resource management, equitable resource management, just settlements and just transitions are absolutely the key to this. But instead, we're sowing the seeds for more devastation as climate change bites, and we're seeing more unpredictable habitats and more unpredictable weather events and the further deterioration of the ecosystems within this place. Then we need a reset. And I think the concept of looking at nature rights and peace building in a post-conflict society is the most vital question. It's not one that President would be aired, but it is the most vital question facing this country of ours.
Do you have any plans for the text of the victim impact assessment outside court proceedings? For example, maybe setting it to music?
I love that idea. Can you sing? No? Are you a musician?
I actually am.
I thought you meant music. But yeah, let's do it. What the rights of nature also tells us, because nature is complex and diverse and we don't know where it's going to go, and water in particular will always find its own path, is that we say yes, not to everything, but to 99% of things. And we were just reflecting in the office there this morning about a major victory in terms of the petroleum licensing regime being thrown out of Northern Ireland just 7 days ago, and a ban on new petroleum licenses, not just fracking, but every single type of petroleum extraction and exploration, is what made that happen. And all of us were heavily involved in those challenges. And it consumed our lives for 8-9 years. Some of us still have the physical scar tissue of those battles. But it was the dinner makers and the artists who kept the campaigners going. There were protest sites, that ran for several months, with hundreds of people turning up every day and running battles at night between the police and private security of the companies. And it was very difficult. What kept people going was musicians. There was one beautiful image in my head of the riot police turning up just outside Carrickfergus in a forest called Woodburn. This was a protected water catchment that had been given away by Northern Ireland Water to a fracking company. Work that out. This water supplied Belfast. People really get water protection, and they have done for years in this country, and it's coming back. And there was a singer, harpist, and she was at the bottom of the road, and she didn't know what to do. There was about 50 riot police turned up with guns, with batons, and there was going to be another attack. And she just played the harp for them. And it was one of the most stunning moments I've ever witnessed. And even telling the story put hers on the back, and anybody who was touched by that, including the police. By the way, this was all live recorded and sent back to PSNI headquarters. The impact that must have had was profound, in the same way as the impact of this victim impact statement. Luckily, the folks around Derry and the gathering, are really into their language and really into their music and really into what I call beautiful trouble, or someone else called beautiful trouble, but I borrow that term all the time. So yeah, bring it on. Let's do something with it, because what shifts the world, and we're saying it with the rights of nature, is a better story, and we have a better story than them. And of course, nature should have rights. How arrogant were we to think it couldn't have rights? So, yeah, let's express it in the ways that touch our head, but also our hearts.
Who will speak for the River Faughan? Who will speak for the endangered Atlantic salmon that migrate to the river from Greenland and spawn into its gravels? Who will speak for its protected otters, its trees such as the oaks, alder, and the willow? It is now time that someone speaks up for the Faughan.
In this second
and
part,
allows us
6
our
months
river
on,
to
we
have
will be
their voices
discussing the
heard.
sentencing of 2 company directors on the 6th of June 2025, both having admitted their roles in running one of Europe's biggest illegal dumps at Mobuoy on the outskirts of Derry. We are joined by Dean Blackwood, a leading campaigner on the River Faughan. Hello, Dean, and welcome to the podcast. In the last interview, James Orr mentioned that you had a personal connection with the river. Could you tell us what that entails and how this has impacted your role in campaigning for the river throughout this case?
Sure. I think one of my fellow directors on the River Faughan Anglers sums it up very beautifully when he said he was born in Derry but reared on the River Faughan. And that stands for many of us that grew up around the Faughan. My earliest memories are of the river, and I think being taken there by my father, spending time there with my great uncle over 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, the fact that has created a real attachment to the river, not just in the sense of the aesthetic beauty of the river, but a more deeper feeling and attachment to that sense of place.
The 2 directors have been sentenced to a total of 33 months imprisonment for their role in running one of Europe's biggest illegal dumps at Mobuoy by the River Faughan. In your eyes, does the punishment fit the crime? I know local politicians to the area, such as Gregory Campbell, have voiced that he thinks the sentencing has been too lenient, for example.
Yeah, and I understand where they're coming from here. This was an unprecedented environmental crime. It was described by BBC Radio 4 as one of the biggest environmental crimes in the history of the UK. So for an unprecedented crime, you might expect an unprecedented sentence. And did we get one? Perhaps not. I think the maximum sentence could have been 5 years, and what we're looking at here is 21 months and 1 year sentence, and of course they'll only spend half of that in prison itself. But in the other way, it was unprecedented because I think it's the first time in Northern Ireland that someone has gone to prison for an environmental crime, or it's certainly someone has received quite a substantial custodial sentence for an environmental crime. I did hear that there was someone sentenced to 6 weeks some time ago, but at that, it is quite an unprecedented sentence in that we're now seeing somebody actually being given a custodial sentence for environmental waste crime.
What was the significance of Judge Rafferty's comments in the run-up to the sentencing when he told the court, "Time has long passed where those who commit environmental crime motivated by greed can expect to walk free from the consequences of their actions"? Are we at a turning point in the court's treatment of environmental crime in Northern Ireland, perhaps?
I think it's very early to say. I would like to think so, because given the fact that this is an unprecedented crime, I didn't expect any different from the judge. I did expect him to hand down custodial sentences. That wasn't widely expected amongst the press or other people involved in the case. But certainly from our perspective, we could not see anything other than a severe custodial sentence. It is significant, but it's only as significant as we make it in the sense that we now need to be emphasising this and pushing this in the future.
In the first part of this podcast, we focused a lot on the River Victim Impact Statement on behalf of the River Faughan that you helped to draft. The Public Prosecution Service has confirmed to Dr. Peter Doran, who's been working on this podcast with us, that the statement was sent to the defence representatives for inclusion in the judge's papers. Is this the first time that a statement citing the rights of a river's legal rights has been put before a court in our jurisdiction?
As far as I'm aware, yes. And it was probably quite a novel approach. And it wasn't done with any expectation that it would be paid much heed to, but it was done to make a point. We have the guilty parties who have rights of personhood in the law their companies also have those rights, but the River Faughan, which is likely to be most affected by their criminal activities, has no rights. So from that perspective, what we were doing was essentially exercising our local right to speak on behalf of the river because it has no voice.
And how did it feel to be a part of that process?
Well, it was interesting in the sense that we didn't really know how to go about it at the start because given the fact that it may well have been the first time that it was done. So it was a learning process. It was important to try and emphasise the point that the law does need to change. And I think that was summed up beautifully by Paul Pousland, who attended an event here in Queen's about rights of nature recently, where he was setting out very much the ways that rights of nature can be effective. And he set out three areas. He set out local voluntary actions and then the transfer of private environmental rights to communities. And then, of course, the legislative process where an act of Parliament or the Assembly could impose rights of nature. So that struck very much with us in that it sort of made us realise that what we were doing is that we were acting locally and voluntary on behalf of the river, that we were acting as if the river had already had rights. And from that perspective, that's something that we can learn from going forward, that we should, in events like this, we should act on behalf of the river on the basis that it already has those rights of nature.
So, the Minister of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, Andrew Muir, intends to launch a public consultation on the draft for the remediation strategy of the Mobuoy dump site, which will include key strategies to protect the River Faughan and its water quality. What would you expect to see in this document to adequately fix the damage caused by the crimes committed against it?
Well, the strategy has been launched, so it's now in the public realm, and it's early days. It's only been out a few days, so I haven't read it in detail, but I have skimmed it, and what I would have expected isn't there. So I have found it disappointing in the sense that it suggests to me that we're not as far forward as the public would have expected or hoped. What we're seeing, for instance, is that there is no preferred remediation strategy. So it might have been better if the government were coming out and said, this is what we think is the best to do. We can't take it out here. We might take the waste out here. But in fact, the Minister has emphasised that there is no preferred strategy for remediation as yet. So that in itself will widen public comment, and maybe unhelpfully, because I expect people are going to be saying it's got to all come out, and that of course will be the most expensive option. But there may be reasons why it would be environmentally harmful to take it all out. So from that perspective, some steer from the government in terms of what would the preferred strategy would have been helpful. There's no indication about what money will be available to carry out the remediation strategy. Therefore, even if you are commenting on it, where the money's coming from to do it is still very unclear. So from those perspectives, I would have really liked to have seen what the government think should be done and let us comment on that. And indeed, where is the money likely to come from to allow the remediation strategy? The one other area I would be concerned with is that there was a comment from Minister Muir about that they may be able to prioritise the A6 road proposals, which cut across part of the illegal landfill. And that to me sends out the wrong message, that again, here we are prioritising the economy over the environment and indeed the social aspects of what has happened at Mobuoy. So from that perspective, slightly disappointing. I might change my mind when I get through the strategy in detail, but I haven't done that as yet.
In part one, we talked about how environmental crimes and neglect are often linked with post-conflict societies such as Northern Ireland. Due to this, Northern Ireland obviously has a border with the south of Ireland, but we share many ecosystems despite having two governments. How would this cross-border element impact these issues?
Well, very much so, and I think we even see it, never mind in relation to illegal waste disposal, but we also see it in relation to the Climate Act now, where there is a requirement for the authorities here, or the government here, to act in as far as possible in conjunction with the government down south to ensure that there is joined up thinking. That has to be the case for dealing with environmental crime also, because there has been major cross-border movement of waste. There is no hard evidence of it in relation to Mobuoy, in relation to the prosecution, but there's certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence from local residents saying about how many of the lorries had southern registrations that were coming to and from the dump. So, of course, the cross-border element of it is something that both governments have to take a focus on and ensure that they're acting together.
Lady Chief Justice, in comments outside the court, has said, referring to Lough Neagh, whatever the ultimate outcome of the legal wrangling in this area are, there is a parallel process which involves innovative and alternative environmental governance approaches. They seek to address environmental issues at their root cause. One of these, known as the rights of nature, is gaining some traction across Europe, and it's obviously pertinent in terms of issues that we have in relation to the deterioration of some of our infrastructure here environmentally, including Lough Neagh. How significant are these remarks, and are there signs that the rights of nature debate, pioneered by groups like Friends of the Earth and the Centre for Democratic and Environmental Rights, have begun to register across the legal profession here in Northern Ireland?
Well, the fact that it's coming from the Lady Chief Justice suggests that it is significant. And there are signs. And the personal impact statement, it's not actually a victim impact statement, it's a personal impact statement. There's a subtle difference apparently. But the personal impact statement served by and on behalf of the River Faughan is perhaps one of those innovative approaches that we can build on. So absolutely, it's important that we, going forward, that we promote the rights of nature. We have, for instance, motions passed in councils where I come from in Derry. The Derry Strabane Council have passed a rights of nature motion, recognising the rights of nature. But the fact is, the question has to be, do they understand what they voted for? I think that the councillors proposing it absolutely do, but I'm not convinced that many of the other councillors that voted for it have a grasp of what it is they were endorsing. So there's a lot of work there to do, including through innovative practices, to open the minds of those that are in positions to legislate.
What more changes would you like to see within the legal system in order to protect our environment? Is there any changes within legislation, any changes within how we operate environmental cases like this in the courts that you would like?
Well, in particular with operating how prosecutions are brought, absolutely. If we go back to the sentencing, the judge in his sentencing remarks said that he would have been comfortable handing down a 3-year and a 2-year sentence, but he then went on to say why he was mitigating that. And one of the areas of mitigation was, he referred to it as Article 6 mitigation. And what he meant there was Article 6 of the Human Rights Act, where you have a right to a fair trial. And he wasn't critical per se, but what he was doing was he was giving a reduced sentence of 6 months on the basis that the prosecuting authorities had unduly delayed the prosecution process, and that had impinged on the guilty party's human rights. So what I would really like to see is government taking notice of that and making sure that they bring prosecutions in an effective and timely manner.
You and others have called for a public inquiry, and Minister Muir has said that there is merit in this. Who will make this decision, and what form should such an inquiry take?
Well, it'll be interesting to see what form it takes, because this is not a new thing. When Mobuoy was first exposed by the BBC Spotlight team in February 2014, the Assembly debate the following month voted unanimously for a public inquiry. And whilst they have no authority to invoke that a public inquiry, that's the role of the executive. So that was taken to the Environment Minister, took the papers on a public inquiry to the executive, and he did not find any support, or didn't find enough support within the executive. So the public inquiry languished with the executive, not just once but twice. Once in 2014 and I think again 2016. Subsequently, the unilateral decision not to proceed with the public inquiry was taken by the DAERA Minister Edwin Poots at the time, and there's reason to believe now why that would be unlawful given what we've seen in terms of the judgment handed down in the No Gas Caverns case, where his unilateral decision there on the marine licence was quashed on the basis that it was seen to be controversial and cross-cutting, and certainly Mobuoy is both of those. From that perspective, any new calls for public inquiry will now need to be brought again by the Minister for DAERA to the executive, and he will need to secure the support of his executive colleagues if the public inquiry is to go ahead. And unfortunately, what we've seen previously was that when the Minister did bring the public inquiry, the parties that were very publicly supportive of the public inquiry in the Assembly were then, behind closed doors as their executive ministers, were able to scupper that inquiry. So that is a bit worrying that we might see the same process again. So what we really want is openness and transparency from our executive in terms of if they support the need for the public inquiry, and if not, why not?
What would be the terms of reference for this inquiry?
Well, I mean, the terms of reference previously are set out in the motion, and the motion was quite wide-reaching in the sense that although it was Mobuoy that triggered the public inquiry, there was a recognition that as bad as it is, Mobuoy is just a symptom of a much wider problem or malaise in environmental governance in Northern Ireland. So on that basis, the inquiry was to look at the impact of waste, illegal waste disposal across Northern Ireland, and it was also widened to look at the impacts that unauthorised minerals extractions and quarries were having in Northern Ireland, because they become the ready-made repositories for vast amounts of waste. So I don't see any reason to depart from the original terms of reference that were essentially set out in the motion that was unanimously passed in 2014.
What does the overall case tell us about systemic failures in our environmental governance and regulatory oversight?
Well, I think what it tells us is, one, it's probably much worse than we ever imagined. But more importantly for me, I think it tells us that there's a real reluctance to address the problem. And I don't believe that's just coming from executive ministers or indeed politicians, but I think there's a real reluctance within the civil service to address the problem, because I think the worry is that they know how bad it is, and ultimately that a public inquiry is likely to expose the true extent of their institutional neglect.
Do you think the impact of this case will be a wake-up call for how we are letting unethical business practices infect our environment? For example, how Lough Neagh is facing severe algae pollution as the result of fertiliser runoff from farming?
I would like to think so, but I'm not so convinced that it will. I think what we have here in Northern Ireland is a very deeply embedded emphasis on economy over environmental and indeed social protections. And that really requires a complete culture change within the organisation, within our planning and within our regulatory bodies. And I don't believe we're seeing that. And we also need it from our politicians. And I don't believe we're seeing it either. So let's hope so. But I think the emphasis, as always, will be on the ordinary citizen to drive that change, because we can't expect our regulatory authorities or our politicians to do it for us.
What could any ordinary person who is listening to the podcast today do to help fight to protect our environment and hold those responsible for protecting it accountable?
Well, there are many ordinary people doing extraordinary things, whether that's through taking court cases without legal representation as litigants in person, setting up organisations and pressure groups to keep that pressure on their politicians, calling out failures of local government. So I think ultimately what local people need to do is realise that it's only them that really can drive the change that they need in their local campaigns or their local areas. But there are support networks for them where they can join and get support and also speak with a collective voice. That might be through, for instance, the likes of the Environmental Gathering, which I was a co-founder of. And whilst it was co-founded specifically to keep the public emphasis on Mobuoy because we were concerned that would disappear, it has flourished into an organisation where we have over 60 community organisations, many of them only set up to tackle environmental governance failures, and many individual campaigners. So I think if any individual has an issue or a campaign, what they need to do is understand that they're the right people to address it at the outset, but that the support is out there for them and come looking for it.
That's all the questions we have today. Thank you for coming in, Dean.
My pleasure.
To harm the rights of nature. We recognise that current environmental laws are interpreted in ways that treat nature as a commodity or property. We declare the River Faughan is a natural ecosystem and possesses intrinsic rights, including the right to naturally exist, flourish, regenerate, and evolve, the right to restoration, recovery, and wilding, the right to carry out its natural functions and to be free of activities or practices that infringe upon these rights, the right to independently maintain its own life-sustaining relationship with other ecosystems and living creatures. We also declare the highest protection for our river and its native species through the recognition of legal naturehood or legal personhood for the River Faughan.